The air on the El Mirage test track was dry, scalding, and heavy, loaded with the metallic scent of aviation fuel and the fine dust that infiltrated everything. The relentless California sun reflected off the dark green paint of a Ford Mustang GT 390. Inside, Steve McQueen, the very archetype of encapsulated coolness, adjusted his leather gloves. He didn't smile. He never smiled for the camera, unless it was absolutely necessary for the script. His eyes, an icy, penetrating blue, scanned the horizon. But the real landscape he saw was somewhere much farther away, in the devastated childhood he tried to outrun with every mile per hour. The roar of the 440 Magnum engine was not just sound, it was a vibrating shield. That deafening noise protected him, pushed the world away, confirmed that he was in control, a mastery that real life off-screen, never allowed him to have. He was the king of cool, but behind the worn leather jacket and the Purcell sunglasses, there was a running sore, an open wound that governed every relationship, every reckless decision, every relentless pursuit of speed and danger. This is the story of Steve McQueen, the star who shone brightest, but whose light was so hot that no one could get close without being burned. It is the painful truth about why the man who defined American masculinity spent his entire life trying to run away from himself, building invisible walls of paranoia and control. Born Terrence Stephen McQueen in 1930 in Beech Grove, Indiana, his debut in life was not a red carpet, but a cold, dirty floor of abandonment. His father, William, a stunt pilot, disappeared 6 months after his birth, like smoke in the wind. His mother, Julian, was a wandering alcoholic soul, more concerned with finding the next man in the next drink than raising a son. He was a nuisance, a small body she barely tolerated. At the age of 3, the smell of cheap gin and the sound of nightly arguments were traded for the fresh, heavy air of his Uncle Claude's farm in Slater, Missouri. This was the first abandonment, the first deep cut that taught him that love was temporary and pain permanent. On Claude's farm, there was a brutal but secure routine. At least there was food and work. Little Steve learned to tend cattle, smelling the hay, manure, and sour sweat under the Midwest sun. But that security was ripped away again. At 12, Elsie retrieved him, dragging him back to the turbulence of New York. The change was catastrophic. Steve, now a country boy, felt thrown into a concrete and addiction hell. The streets of New York, with their damp alleys and lurking danger, became his new home. He stole, joined gangs, and the ghosts of maternal neglect materialized in chronic violence and disobedience. The smell of burning marijuana and the ephemeral heat of prostitutes replaced the smell of the barn. He was uncontrollable, a teenager who had learned that the only way to survive was to strike first. Fate intervened in the form of a frustrated judge who, after an endless series of petty crimes, sentenced him to the Boys' Republic, a reform school for troubled boys in Chino Hills, California. The boarding school was severe, with raw brick walls and a military regime. At first, Steve hated every minute, resisting authority with the stubbornness that would make him famous. But, ironically, it was there that he found the first stable father figure, a counselor who saw past the cynicism and recognized the contained rage. The discipline and structure, the strict rules, calmed the inner storm, giving him a map to channel his aggression. He never forgot the feeling of the rough Boys' Republic uniform, a symbol of his humiliation and, simultaneously, his redemption. After leaving there, he wandered, doing odd jobs, from carpenter to lumberjack, until, at 17, he saw the Navy. Enlisting in the Marines was not patriotism. It was a desperate search for more structure, for a place where being tough was not just acceptable, but required. The smell of gunpowder and engine oil became his new scent. He was a good Marine, disciplined in action, but insubordinate in spirit. Once, he spent 41 days in solitary confinement after stealing a tank. This duality, the desire for belonging and the need for rebellion, defined his life. When he left the service, the emptiness called him back. Luck changed when he discovered he could use his internal discipline and rough charm to act. He went to New York, living in poverty, earning scholarships at the prestigious neighborhood playhouse. The smell of motor grease was replaced by the smell of cheap stage makeup and anxious sweat. He was different. He didn't have the polished accent of East Coast actors. He smelled like real danger. His face, marked by the sun and experience, told stories that others merely performed. Success was gradual but explosive. Small roles until television transformed him into Josh Randall, the bounty hunter in Wanted, Dead or Alive. Suddenly, he was no longer the abandoned boy from Indiana. He was a black leather icon, virile and silent, solving problems with an unusual caliber weapon, the mare's leg. The sound of leather boots on the set on the sand and the smell of the horse became synonymous with his public persona. But the rise to fame only amplified his deep insecurity. He carried that insecurity into Hollywood, where the glare of neon lights masked the inner decay he knew so well. The Magnificent Seven catapulted him, but it was in The Great Escape that he cemented himself as the man. The moment the motorcycle leaped over the barbed wire was not just a stunt, it was McQueen challenging gravity and fate. He refused to use doubles whenever possible, seeking real risk, because only real risk could momentarily silence the voices of abandonment in his mind. Success brought money, lots of money, and with it, paranoia. Steve McQueen was famous for his nearly obsessive demand for authenticity and control. On film sets, he was a silent dictator. If the script asked him to look left and he felt that looking right was truer, he looked right. The aroma of Cuban cigars in his trailer and the distant sound of checks being endorsed were the new backdrop of his life, but the air remained suffocating. He trusted no one. Women came and went, but his first wife, Neil Adams, felt the full force of his jealousy and his inability to commit emotionally. He loved her, in his possessive way, but the only person he could truly trust was himself, and even then, only when traveling at 150 miles per hour. The marriage was a claustrophobic dance of explosive fights and silent reconciliations. The smell of alcohol and fury hung over the Brentwood house, which he slowly transformed into a fortress, equipped with an arsenal worthy of a small army. With Bullitt, 1968, he reached the pinnacle. San Francisco, the steep streets, the guttural sound of the V8 engine echoing between the brick buildings. That chase sequence, the most iconic in cinematic history, was not acting. It was Steve McQueen in his element, speed as catharsis, flight as a profession. That Mustang was the perfect shell for the man who refused to be caught by anything, especially emotions. However, the price of fame was increasing distance. He isolated himself. He treated producers with contempt, directors with suspicion. He believed everyone was trying to steal something from him, his time, his money, his soul. This distrust was not unfounded, but it was hypertrophied by trauma. When the Manson family terrorized Hollywood in 1969, McQueen was on a list of potential targets, having attended parties at Sharon Tate's house. This scare only cemented his paranoia. He bought more guns, reinforced the locks. He slept with a 9mm revolver under his pillow, the cold, hard metal serving as a glacial substitute for human intimacy. This paranoia reached its climax during the filming of Le Mans, 1971. The film was his passion project, an ode to pure speed, but it became a nightmare of costs, egos, and accidents. He tried to control every detail, from the camera angle to the weather. The intense aroma of hot engine oil and the constant vibration of the camera on his helmet were his world. He refused to interact, communicating only through his manager and his lawyers. He was happier alone, in the deafening isolation of a race car, where the rules of the track were clear and the rules of the heart did not exist. The failure of Le Mans and his divorce from Neil left him even more bitter. He quickly married Ally McGraw, the beauty from Love Story, but that marriage was even more tempestuous. Ally described life with Steve as an emotional roller coaster, filled with drugs, possessive jealousy, and the constant feeling that he was always on the verge of exploding. He tried to fill the void with speed, cocaine, and the incessant pursuit of strong sensations. He was addicted to danger, because danger was predictable, tenderness was not. The transition to the late 70s was melancholic. The unrestrained lifestyle began to take its physical toll. He withdrew from Hollywood, tired of the falseness, and moved to Santa Paula, California. He became a recluse, riding antique motorcycles, restoring planes, and living in a world of rust, gasoline, and silence. He grew a beard, wore jeans, and allowed himself to age. The king shed his crown. He was desperately trying to reconnect with the simple boy from the Missouri farm before trauma turned him into a legend. It was during this period of reclusion that life's cruelest blow was delivered. In 1979, the diagnosis, malignant pleural mesothelioma, aggressive, incurable cancer, directly linked to the massive exposure to asbestos that he inhaled during his days as a Marine, pipe insulation, and, ironically, in his racing suits, which contained asbestos for fire resistance. The speed he loved so much would finally catch up to him, but not in a race car. It would be slowly from the inside. The smell of death hung over him. The invincible king of cool was dying of something he couldn't overcome with a cold stare or a car chase. His quest for authenticity led him to deny Western medicine, to fear the medical establishment as much as he feared Hollywood producers. He fled again, this time to Mexico, to Rosarito, in search of controversial alternative treatments, such as shark cell injections and supposed miracle cures. The smell of salty sea and clinic disinfectant felt like a farewell. By his side in the final months was Barb Maminti, a young model he had met and married. She saw him in his most vulnerable state, without the shield, without the Mustang, without the pose. She saw the 3-year-old abandoned boy who had never healed. In his final moments, the fury and paranoia subsided, replaced by a melancholic acceptance. He finally allowed someone to get close when there was nothing left to defend. Steve McQueen died on November 7, 1980, at the age of 50, following experimental surgery to reduce the tumor. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean, the vast, cold blue that resembled his soul. The king of cool was gone, but the story of his life is not a celebration of fast cars and leather jackets. It is a case study on trauma. The painful truth is that Steve McQueen was a man constantly running from his past. He used speed, fame, aggression, and emotional distance as armor against the original abandonment. The reason no one could truly get close to him was not arrogance, it was fear. The fear that, if he allowed proximity, that person would finally discover the scared, wounded boy he kept under lock and key. And, worse still, the fear that this person, just like his mother and father, would abandon him again, proving that pain was, in fact, the only permanent thing in the life of Terrence Stephen McQueen. And so he chose solitude, the cold and brutal distance of the legend, instead of the warm and risky proximity of the man. The story of Steve McQueen, after all, is not about the race he won, but about the life he could never stop running from.